So in this video, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of earnings per share and the primary topics that we're going to cover in Chapter 19. So when you compute basic EPS, it is simply a ratio of earnings over shares. And the measure of earnings we're going to use is an earnings that is attributable to common shareholders. The way we make that happen is we take net income and we subtract out any preferred dividends that may accrue to preferred shareholders. Then what we're going to do is divide out the weighted average number of shares outstanding. So this ratio here is going to give you basic EPS. Okay? And we talked in class about how to create weighted average shares outstanding. We talked in class about how to compute the preferred dividend. And then net income is just going to be bottom line net income from the income statement. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this video is just to show that when we compute diluted EPS, we just build off of basic EPS and add any potential common shares that could arise from different types of securities that the company has issued. And there's three primary securities that we discuss in class, and there's some other additional ones that are in the back of the chapter, but we're going to focus on the three primary ones. So the first one is going to be stock options. Okay, so let me just put those in a green box here. So stock options can only have a denominator effect. Why? Because when employees exercise their stock options, it will not have any income effect whatsoever. The only effect it can have is by causing a whole bunch of new shares to be issued. And so the fact that a company has stock options on its books that are unexercised means that it has all of these potential unissued shares that will arise if all of the stock options are exercised. So the way we account for that in the denominator is just to simply take the number of shares that would arise out of the exercise of stock options, and then we use this treasury stock method that I talked about in class. And what we do there is we take the proceeds that would come from the exercise of the stock options, and we make the decision that with those proceeds we will buy treasury stocks on the open market at the at the average price throughout the year. And we're going to subtract out the number of treasury shares. So the difference between those two is going to be added into the denominator of diluted EPS. Okay? So again, stock options do not have a numerator effect. They only have a denominator effect that represents the difference between the number of shares that would arise from the exercise of the stock options and the number of shares that the proceeds of stock options could buy off the open market for the treasury. Okay, now let's turn to convertible preferred stock. All right. So for that, I'm going to put a blue box around it so you can see the difference between those and other types of potentially dilutive shares. Convertible preferred stock has a numerator and a denominator effect. Now it turns out the denominator effect is quite easy. It's just the number of new shares that arise as a result of the conversion. So if the preferred shareholders convert their preferred shares into common shares, we're just going to report the new number of common shares down here in the denominator. The numerator is not so challenging either. In fact, all we're going to do is add back the preferred dividend that we subtracted out in basic EPS. So the number here in basic EPS, if the preferred stock also happened to be convertible, we're going to have to add it back in when we compute diluted EPS. Now suppose that they're not convertible preferred shares, then we're still going to take the preferred dividend out of the computation of basic EPS, but we won't make any adjustment at all in computing diluted EPS. Okay. And then finally, we need to talk about convertible debt, which I'll do in red. Okay, so convertible debt has both a numerator and a denominator effect. So the effect of convertible debt in the denominator is also easy. We're just simply going to report the number of new common shares that would result from the conversion of the debt. The numerator is simply after-tax interest expense. Okay. The way I will do a big problem like this is I will start off by computing basic EPS. Then I will incrementally consider the effects of each of these three types of securities that could potentially dilute EPS. You will also need to consider whether each of these in isolation has an anti-dilutive effect. If one of these happens to be anti-dilutive, then we would not include it. So suppose, for example, that we consider the stock options in isolation, then later the convertible preferred stock, and then later the convertible debt. In that case, and suppose that, for example, we find out that the stock options are dilutive, the convertible preferred stock are anti-dilutive, and the convertible debt are dilutive. If that's the case, then when we compute diluted EPS, we would simply ignore all of the convertible preferred stock in computing diluted EPS. But we would still include the effects of the stock options because they're dilutive, and the effects of the convertible debt because they are dilutive. Okay. So I think that is a quick primer on the basics of computing basic EPS and diluted EPS, and good luck.